University of Guelph has been a really big part of my life, and right from let me think about this, 82. I came down, my ex-husband and I had moved to Elora to open a hardware store. We were really young, we were really naive, but I loved food even then. I loved learning to cook. And there was this wild and wonderful professor at the university, Jo Marie Powers, who was teaching I can't even remember the exact title of the course. It was Cultural Foods anyhow. I think that was what she called it. And she had 5 sons and I had 4, and misery loved company. So she said, you know, I've got this idea. Maybe we can just get together and write a cookbook. Let's go to the farmers markets of Canada, or of Ontario rather. And, you know, those vendors, they always have leftovers at the end of the day. And maybe they have recipes that we can collect. So that's what we did. And that was really the very first published food book that I had accomplished, and it's sort of the banner of and how I really got to know the University of Guelph. And after that, it was one introduction after another, and it was particularly amazing. And as I journeyed through life, there were a lot of things that happened. I mean, you sort of look back, I guess you get long in the tooth, and you see how you've been directed or how it's flowed if you have the opportunity to open your arms to it. And there were a number of turning points, some not so hot, but this one wasn't really all that great either, but it really did change my perception of what was going on. I was out in Vancouver, and it was in the very early 90s. The International Association of Culinary Professionals, which was based in the U.S. Lots of cookbook authors, a few chefs, some producers, but it was a big deal to have it outside of the borders of the U.S. And the keynote speaker at lunch at a hotel, and the dining room was full of about 500 people. It was quite large, and he said, "I subscribe to the theory that BC will be the 51st state of the Union." And the Canadians in the audience went, "Ah," and most of the Americans apologized. And but then I thought, oh, what if he's right? What if he's right? Because there is so much from our communications right through to the foods that come up. Our whole culture is influenced by that south of the border, and it's a really, really huge problem for us. And then I thought, well, okay, so how do I make it different? And that really sort of is the beginning, I think, of the story. So the following images are basically most of my own. There are some that come from Bob Wigington, who was my photographer for the last 2 books. And then basically that's it. There's one from a National Geographic publication, because I just didn't happen to have a picture of Ulucan, Greece. Anyway, so that's it. So Canada is food, from Grease Trails to a Mars mission. This is the building of a culinary nation. Canada is an ancient land. In the beginning, long before humanity crept along the coast of this ice-shrouded continent, or paddled the St. Lawrence. That's the St. Lawrence was in a previous picture. There was food. Salmon fossils in Lake Kamloops have been dated at 18,000 years old. When non-natives arrived, they found a culture that was already rich, very rich. There was active agriculture, although we really didn't see it as such. The First Nations were cultivating corn, beans, and squash. They were tending clam gardens. They were moving plants from one location to another that would be more hospitable. They were actively harvesting and preserving the gifts of the wild. In their trances, the shaman of the West Coast would carve petroglyphs on huge boulders, on driftwood-strewn beaches, as you can see, right at the top of the intertidal zone. And it was there, in British Columbia, that Canada's first Indigenous cooking method, the only Indigenous cooking method, was created. Bentwood boxes from prehistory were used for family meals and the most elaborate feasts. They were skillfully made, often ornately decorated, and they were used for storage and sometimes even for burial. Planks of the sacred cedar, and as you know, the West Coast has a lot of cedar, and it is sacred to the First Nations. The planks were notched and bent and then sewn together. They were filled with seawater to soak for several days so that the boards would expand. Then hot rocks would be added on the right-hand side. Eric Peterson from April Point Lodge was doing that many years ago. Seafood was added, prawns, scallops, clams, chunks of salmon, cod, snowy white halibut. Over the millennia, trade routes had stretched across our landmass, creating giant culinary supply lines of prehistory. It's a web of connectivity that we have yet to emulate anywhere. There were no borders save linguistic, no boundaries save geographic. There was a rhythm to life, and a reasonably good weather on the coast allowed them to trade inland and north and south. One of the most important trade goods was the Kumasi Lily. The edible root was so prized and is such a great trade good that the site of the city of Victoria is built on a Salish processing site. Digging and drying and trading, that's what they did. Seaweed was big, and even today you can see it, see if I've got a pointer, drying on the rooftops up in Bella Bella. There's this really herring rose dried on kelp, that's actually on hemlock, and that's a really lovely ready snack when you go out the back door. But it was the other trade good, Ulican grace, that was the most prized. The fish was so oily that when it was dried, it could be used as a candle. It was this oil, in its fermented state, that was the most valuable food of all. It was seasoned. Basically, it was left to, I would call rot, but it wasn't. They seasoned it. When the head fell away from the body, it was ready to be cooked in large vats of water. And then the fat would rise up, the oil would rise up, and it was skimmed off. It's an acquired taste, but for First Nations out there, it's really a taste of home. But it was this one wee fish, and the trading route inland from Bella Coola, that was the way that the first non-native reached the Pacific Ocean. Probably the first human to cross the continent. The grease trail from Bella Coola into the interior became effectively Canada's first food route, the one that the great explorer Alexander Mackenzie followed to arrive at the Pacific Ocean. Using a mixture of vermilion and grease, he wrote, Alexander Mackenzie from Canada by land, the 22nd of July, 1793. The meeting of food cultures was at one point in human history a very gradual process. Cross-fertilization between the host and guest cuisines. Scholars Jean-Louis Flandrin and Massimo Montanari wrote, every culture is contaminated by other cultures. Every tradition is a child of history, and history is never static. Our hosts taught us to use maple syrup, and we adapted. The heated Fleumier cheese in Quebec melts into a pool of golden spring sweetness. They shared their pumpkins, and we made soup. From seaweed and salmon roe, my son Mark makes salty akura to top his perfect sushi. They showed us how to smoke salmon that now tops the best okonomiyaki that I've ever savored at John Bill's wee restaurant, Honest Weight, in Toronto. Every nation on earth has a storehouse of ingredients from other places. Although the first settlers here came for fish and furs and freedom, they also brought with them some very real food traditions and ingredients that support those traditions. The early settlers rarely understood what was considered as food for the First Nations, although countless would not have survived had it not been for some Indigenous knowledge. Most had sailed away, my ancestors did, from lands where inequality and brutality were the norm. If you want to have a truly moving experience, visit Pier 21 in Halifax. They traveled through the winter storms and came to a land unfamiliar with, they were not familiar at all with the animals and many of the plants. They brought seeds from wheat and grain and flax to apples, all the tree fruits, and journeyed into a land where there was one reality, winter. They had to use what they knew. I can't imagine what it would have been like 150 years ago here in Wellington County. They also brought tenacity. The men and women and children who came, like those who journeyed up the Garifraxa Road right there into the Queen's Bush, were not a bunch of wusses. Their foods sustained them. And in those very, very early days, because transportation costs were so high and supply lines so easily interrupted, growing and eating locally was absolutely essential. Although one itinerant fisherman wrote home from Newfoundland in 1578 that he'd sown wheat, barley, and oats, basically crops he was familiar with in England, he rode off into the sunrise without ever confirming a harvest. Thankfully, others kept diaries. In 1611, chickens were laying plentifully in Conception Bay. Apples were first cultivated at Champlain's Port Royal, largely for cider but also for eating. And when the apple orchards of Europe were devastated several centuries later, Nova Scotia Cape Breton orchardists sent apple seedlings back to France by the thousands. Farm wives made cheese and butter from the rich milk of the summer. They adapted their food to the situation. Think of butter tarts or tarte au sucre. Likely the eggs would be probably from Chanticleer chickens, butter, cream perhaps from Canadian cows, and wheat flour for pastry. The earliest incarnations would have used maple sugar. Salted beef and a whole array of charcuterie from summer sausage and hams were made. Pickling and preserving and jamming were all part of the summer chores. Apples were dried for winter pies, and apple butter were made, and fruits actually were put down for the winter meals and desserts all year round. Do we say put down or put up? I'm not sure. I always say put down. Who says put up? Okay. Where are you from? No, I don't know. In farmhouses, there were fruit cellars like this one. This is just outside of Elora, where meat was cured and onions were hung to dry. The row of newspapers at the bottom, so it's relatively new image, are all wrapped around cabbages that they were storing for the winter. And of course there's all the tomato, they call it tomato sauce, tomatoes, and look at all those pickles. It was fantastic. There was no heat in that basement either, actually. It's pretty interesting. Root cellars like this one in Elliston, central Newfoundland, were absolutely essential and a serious part of community life. Elliston is claiming that they have more root cellars than any other community on earth, and they probably do because they're all over the place. They're embedded in hillsides and they're really, really well insulated, sometimes with logs, but they store carrots and turnips and potatoes and parsnips throughout the winter. And actually, when I visited, you could see about the time of year it was, probably, I think it was around May, and inside, and I didn't add the picture in, all the carrots had hair all over them, and the potatoes were all sprouting, but they were ready for, they could have served a feast. They really could have. Like root cellars, bread ovens were also part of Quebec's food story. They'd bake crocks of beans in them too, all along the St. Lawrence River. In fact, the bread ovens were built at the hubs of agriculture. And there's a wonderful book called Bread Ovens of Quebec. Anybody know Polestar Bakery? He's got it out on the windowsill. And and I said, I don't know why you're leaving it here. It's very valuable. He said, oh, nobody's going to steal it. It's fine, but it's really worth checking in. Polestar makes fabulous bread. But it was around this time, in the 1800s, 17, 1800s, that real honeybees arrived, along with they came via the 13 colonies, and a whole lot of other introduced garden plants. Ranching of beef cattle was possible once the railway was built, and we began to reverse the trend by shipping cloth-bound cheddar like this one back to Great Britain in the 1800s. In early Canada, there were some very real agricultural milestones. 3 significant moments are worth sharing. In 1874, Canada's first agricultural college was founded here in Guelph, providing education and formalized training. And with it, I believe that the profession of farming took a huge step forward. The discipline of agricultural research then began to take its first tentative steps. Charles Abbott, one of Canada's most noted plant breeders, worked on the first soybeans, releasing OAC 211 in 1924. But it was his OAC 21 barley that was the superstar. It was the foundation of the modern malting industry in Canada and the ancestor of the barleys that now produce such great beer. Yukon Gold potatoes are on menus around the planet, but the first hill was dug near Cambridge, Ontario by the late Gary Johnson some 50 years ago. He bred in disease resistance, and really from Peru into a potato that was prized from Peru, and the rest is culinary history. But I love Gary's quote. He said, "Plant breeders have to be patient people." This resonates down the decades, actually resonates through the centuries. The second huge national event occurred in 1886 with the creation of Canada's experimental farm system that now stretches from Kentville, Nova Scotia to Summerland, BC. Its first director was William Saunders. His name also resonates. His two sons, Percy and Charles, were seriously talented plant breeders. Up until that time, plant breeding was very much hit and miss for farmers. Charles and Percy worked on wheat, made dozens of crosses, and one made by Percy in 1892 when he was at the experimental farm in Agassiz, British Columbia, stood out. He had taken red fife, the grain that had been discovered and shared by David and Mary Fife at their farm near Peterborough, in which the CPR actually gave settlers to lure them out to Manitoba. And he crossed red fife with another one, hard red Calcutta. The resulting wheat was named Marquis. It quickly became the most revolutionary grain ever to hit North America, and by 1920 it made up 90% of the 6.9 million hectares that were seeded in the Canadian prairies in hard red spring wheat. And actually 60% of the hard red spring sown in the US as well. It made superb flour and was the milling standard until 1970. With Marquis wheat, Canada was well on its way to being a world power in export agriculture. The third milestone, and there are others, but the third one that I'd like to talk about tonight is cultural. We think of food movements as being really rather avant-garde. Many of you will know or even be members of the Slow Food Organization. But it was the Women's Institute that played a massive role in the food life of early Canada. Founded by Adelaide Hoodless with help from Erland Lee of the Farmers Institute. And they had a meeting actually down at Creelman with George Creelman, and I haven't got that bit of history actually figured out. But the Women's Institute began and in 1897. Within a very short time, it spread globally to 70 countries. They not only shared recipes, but instructed farm women in safe food handling. Remember, what I find so amazing is this is an era where telephones were a luxury. And the horseless carriages were asked to stay off the roads. And this comes directly from my grandmother, who founded the South Grey Women's Institute. The horseless carriages were asked to stay off the road so the women could get to their meetings. Amazing. You know, I just think it's fabulous. In the early days of my career, I was looking for the real Canadian cuisine. In the restaurant industry, it was absolutely an oxymoron. Not so today, but it was in those days. There were sparks, indeed some fires of excellence. The stunning panoramas and the innovative cuisine of Souk Harbour House, with its extraordinary gardens. The spectacular dishes of Anne Desjardins. She's still cooking in Quebec at her restaurant, which sadly has closed, L'Eau à la Bouche. There was the vinous mecca of Bistro Champlain, with its priceless wine, one full wall of Chateau d'Yquem, another of Chateau Petrus, and its multi-million-dollar collection of original Riopels. Even the lordly Chateau Frontenac had a chef, Jean Soulard, who hopped onto his bike and visited folks, like the renegade raw milk cheesemaker Luc Mailloux of Saint Basile de Portneuf, and the hardy farmer Jean Leblanc at the base of Les Éboulements on the microclimatic shores of the St. Lawrence River. These were such heady times for us. Elora's good-natured Basque chef, Roger Dufault, some may know his nephew, Eric the Baker. He was the first Toronto restaurateur to cook the hearty country food of his region in southwest France with the ingredients of Canada. Joanne Cates adored him. You could only pray someday that you'll actually be able to get a dish, a taste of that steaming bowl of beef bourguignon. The year was 1994, and young Michael Smith was beginning his first PEI gig on Prince Edward Island, well, at the Inn at Bay Fortune. He's gone a long way, hasn't he? In fact, actually, he's coming to the University of Guelph this September. A dedicated winery chef, Michael Allemeyer, preached local cuisine. You can see him preaching and holding forth, and practiced it so thoroughly and so well that he put Mission Hill Winery onto the global map among the 5 top winery restaurants on earth. Chef Michael Stadlander also led the way with his 3 editions of the Canadian Chefs Congress. Few chefs anywhere on earth are as talented and as out there as Michael is. These were some of the game changers, but they were really few and far between. What I found in my travels were stories, tales of men and women from all over the world on the really front lines of Culinary Canada. But it was often the home cooking that really struck me as being the most regional. And often it was the most interesting in the remotest locations you could imagine, where culinary creativity was absolutely the key to survival. Like on the northmost coast of Haida Gwaii, Langara Island, where lightkeeper Lise Brun kept a garden, baked bread daily, and served it with home-smoked mussels that she'd harvested 120 feet from below where she's standing right there. Or way up on the north coast of British Columbia in Sontula on Malcolm Island, founded by immigrants searching for nirvana, and where today, because it's so cold and damp, grapes have to ripen in greenhouses. Or down Cape Breton Back Road, near this beach at Mabu, where Huey Pat MacDonald cooled his Jersey milk in a well before making quite illegal cheese. And he sold it, but we didn't tell. I don't know, it's amazing because the sea change was beginning in those days for me. The culinary conversation expanded with the advent of a number of really excellent publications, regional ones. Canadian Living launched a series of cross-Canada inserts in 1984 when my first article appeared there on the Farmers Markets of Canada. Then about a decade later in the very unfortunately short-lived Food magazine. The plan to hold a conference on Canadian cuisine was hatched at OAC and the Woolly. And in 1993, but the Woolly has a really good history. We have a plaque there. In 1993, Northern Bounty saw food professionals from all across Canada converge on Stratford, Ontario, and it was amazing. There were 6 subsequent conferences, one in Vancouver, Halifax, Calgary, Jasper, Guelph, back here at the university, Kelowna and Winnipeg. They were so far ahead of their time. It was incredible. The National Association Cuisine Canada formed its foundation. Its archives are at the University of Guelph, thanks to Catherine Harvey. The original membership directory of Cuisine Canada held many of our food heroes. Edna Stabler, Food That Really Schmecks. Carol Ferguson, the founding food editor of Canadian Living magazine. Marie Nightingale from out of Old Nova Scotia Kitchens, Guelphites like Rob McLaughlin and Bob Destel, and I see several people here tonight who were at those conferences. Adjunct Professor Jo Marie Powers, while she's more in the cheerleading section now, was absolutely instrumental in creating Cuisine Canada. The University of Guelph also became the repository for Canada's largest Canadian, or the world's largest Canadian cookbook collection. Owen Roberts and his team created the first OAC food inventory with me. Michael McMillan created Food Network Canada. Gastronomy is defined by the study of all that has to do with the nourishment of man. I like to think of mankind. It is reflective eating. Those of us in the room who really truly give a damn about Canadian food and its future, our nation's sovereignty, and it is about our sovereignty, and Canada's position in feeding the projected billions of the world well and ethically, are all part of this incredible gastronomic family, inclusive, intelligent, and ready to make excellent and delicious things happen. When Dr. Michael Simons wrote, "What counts is cooking," somehow get that right, and all else follows. He meant it. If we understand ingredients, we will have to understand other concepts like seasonality and flavor. We'll need to figure out provenance and price, food processing and preservation. We will be forced to communicate. We will talk and joust and share Canadian food ideas and truths, recipes and agricultural advances, how best to preserve our aquatic resources. That's a big one. We will celebrate new restaurants and honor our early food traditions. We must become more self-sufficient, more food and water secure, but we can cook a better world. From Fogo Island in Newfoundland, overlooking the North Atlantic, and isn't that beautiful? And a little lobster shack near Surrey, Prince Edward Island, where Father Johnny Flynn supplies both the oysters and the lobsters. If anybody's had Colville Bay oysters, you'll know how good they are. Right through to Quebec's stellar Les Fougères and Manoir Hovey and Ontario's magnificent Langdon Hall, right out to the Wickenish Inn on the west coast. There are restaurants and innkeepers and chefs who are laying it on the line for Canadian cuisine. Today's chefs have become gurus and stars. Whole regions are awash in talent. What's resulted in this huge nation of ours is the creation of an incredible gastronomic palette. The flavors of Canada, the possibilities are absolutely massive, and in fact, it is indeed happening. We are defining Canadian cuisine in all its glory. Business schools, like our own College of Business and Economics, are reaching out to the world. We have a brand new food institute. There are culinary colleges that can stand on any global stage. We are indeed cooking and creating and serving forth a better Canada. And if you scratch the surface on any ingredient list, it's very likely you'll find someone, somewhere, from the University of Guelph. The International Barcode of Life is tucked away in the corner of U of G, and it's quietly cataloging life on Earth and pointing out a whole lot of food fraud. Close by is Mike Dixon's hypobaric chamber that will provide the fundamental research for feeding our interplanetary explorers. The mission to Mars will have his plants on it. These tomatoes came from seeds that we grew that went whipping around the Earth 171 times in one of the Space Shuttle missions. Hundreds of bean varieties are trialed at the Aurora Research Station by Peter Pauls and his team. Both Dwayne Falk and Vanessa Curry have created a vibrant potato program from one that spawned Yukon Gold. Take AC Metcalf, it's a good barley, one of OAC 21's offspring, combine it with Canadian cultivated hops, and you have an array of awesomeness. Anyone want to go to the Woolly with me afterwards? No, I think it's pretty amazing, actually. You know, Guelph really is setting our Canadian table. Ridgetown tomatoes, trialed by Steve Lowen, are in pretty much every ketchup or tomato product in your cupboard. There's perfect trout from the Alma Research Station, and honey is from the research down at Townsend House. You know, it's really exceptional if you can get your hands on any. There's winter hardy Canadian peanuts that were developed at Simcoe by a team down there when they were doing a transition crop study. And they are the best I've ever tasted. Our root vegetables owe a great deal to the work that it's Anne-Marie MacDonald. Mary Ruth MacDonald. I don't know why I say Anne-Marie. Anyway, Mary Ruth MacDonald, Bradford's Muck Research Station. I think I had to put this one in because I think she'd get even crosser if we didn't include eggs and poultry. Anyway, one of the most significant researchers that you've likely never heard about is this great older gentleman, Dr. Al Slinkard, Professor Emeritus at the University of Saskatchewan. And there is a U of G connection here. Al was a salesman in the land of wheat. He wanted to have some agricultural fun with 30 million acres of arable land. He was tenacious enough to breed prairie hardy lentils and position Canada as the top lentil producer on earth, shipping hundreds of thousands of tons every year. His Laird and Eston lentils are to the culinary world what Marquis wheat, OAC 21 barley, and Yukon gold are, the crop standard for green lentils. Today, 5,000 farmers grow arguably the healthiest food crop on earth, and Canada is now the world's leading exporter of lentils. His legacy lives on in Saskatoon at the Pulse Research Lab, until very recently overseen by Dr. Bert Vandenberg, who was a Guelph grad, of course. There's both fava beans and chickpeas in development there as well. Another visionary, who is now at U of S and is a U of G grad, Dr. Bob Broris, is working on the best sour cherries I have ever eaten, prairie cherries. They're absolutely incredible. Over ice cream made with the dairy products actually from the University of Saskatchewan's dairy program. They were domesticated and perfected a number of years ago. He worked with choke cherries here and also sea buckthorn, and has domesticated and perfected the newest berry on the block, the Haska. He did his graduate work with Al Sullivan, actually I believe at the Aurora Research Station. The list of Canadian success stories is long and delicious, and we have yet to really begin to talk about things like dairy. With Doug Goff in the room, I have to mention ice cream, or aquaculture, as we saw last night with Rich Mokia and the huge crew that was down for a sustainable seafood symposium at the Lifelong Learning Center. It was amazing, actually. We haven't talked about wine either. Without question, 2017, the 150th anniversary of Canada's Confederation, is the most exciting time to be alive in the history of culinary Canada. Canada holds 9% of the world's fresh water and 1.6 hectares of arable land for every Canadian citizen. We've created an utterly priceless national park system, emulated literally around the world. We have research, academic, and agricultural communities that are resilient, creative, and wise. Our future really depends upon celebrating our magnificent differences, our roots and our ethnicity. It depends on creating the best we can from our local ingredients, then selling them to the world. So we can give our entrepreneurs, whether they're farmers or innkeepers, chefs or retailers, an unmistakable edge that no other nation on earth can emulate. A brand, a Canada brand, a cuisine that will last infinitely longer than fashion. Farmers aren't growing commodities, they're growing ingredients so that our cooks can create civilizations. Our Canada is food, and the world is richer for it. Thank you.